Now, Suella Braverman has described the pro-Palestine demonstrations as hate marches after more than 100,000 people took to UK streets over the last 3 weekends. Her comments follow an emergency Cobra meeting chaired by Rishi Sunak, where ministers met with national security officials to assess the domestic security risk after warnings from the Metropolitan Commissioner. Sir Mark Rowley said the events in the Middle East are having a knock-on effect on home soil, leading to a surge in hate crimes and unrest. Well, Braverman has also ordered a review of terrorism and extremism laws after calls for clarity over the language used at pro-Palestinian demonstrations. The Home Office is considering bringing in new offences related to hate speech and supporting terrorism by implication. Lawyers have suggested that acts such as using the word jihad could be encompassed by the crackdown. I have some sympathy for both the Home Secretary and for Mark Rowley in this, even though they both seem to be saying, not me, Gov. You know, it's the police's fault for not cracking down. It's the Home Secretary's fault and the Home Office's fault for not making it clear what is and what isn't hate speech. But I do think there is a wider political play going on at the moment between specifically the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And that's what's making me quite uneasy. We're beginning to see the breakdown, I think, in what was quite a refreshingly unified front between the opposition and the Conservatives after the hideous events where Hamas were attacking the Israelis, where you really had Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak seem to be saying, you know, this is appalling, we must support Israel. It now looks to me like it's getting rather political, and you're seeing people like, I mean political with a small p, people like Braverman, who I think any moment now are going to start saying, Keir Starmer, you're soft on Hamas because you're getting a lot of pressure from your backbenchers, because you've got an issue with which side of the fence you're coming down on and you're supporting. And I'm just worried that that's going to take away from what has been a unified British political response.
Well, I think part of the response, which is so difficult, is because of the way some parts of the media have portrayed this, that if you showed the level of detail that the BBC is now showing with what's going on in with the Palestinians, and look, anybody from any side of this is going to look at the terrible suffering, the human suffering. Of course, you're going to look at those stories, and you are going to be swayed by that. And also, they still refuse to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. You have to look back in history as to how a terrorist organisation was combated, what they did in the first place, and why it is that they're going after them, as opposed to conflating the various issues. We know that the issues over the Middle East are extremely complicated. We know that there have been battles for hundreds, if not thousands of years over lands which are sovereign and who has a right to be there and all that sort of business. That should be separate from what happened on October the 7th and the response that the Israeli government have taken. And then back on our streets, of course there is this political division, because some people seem to think that taking the Palestinian side and ignoring that Hamas is a terrorist organisation, ignoring what's happened to Jewish people over the years, ignoring the huge atrocities which have taken place with Hamas still continuing. This could end tomorrow, by the way, if Hamas decided that they were going to admit defeat, but they're not going to, so they continue to pop the rocks.
To say that it could literally end tomorrow.
It could.
I'm not sure that it is as simple as that.
It won't, but it could.
And I think it's a bit rich, really, of the Home Secretary to say that this was a hate march when she, a few weeks ago, was on stage delivering a hate speech about trans people. I mean, who is she to decide what is hate speech and what isn't when she's literally leading the charge on quite a lot of hate?
And I also think that the Conservatives, time and time again, will like to draw everything in very black and white lines, and everything's about the election for them. So it's all about making what is a really, 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 really serious situation into a culture war. And Suella Braverman continues to do that in the speech and in the words that she uses.
But I agree with you on that.
No. She cannot say that a pro-Palestinian march is a hate march or it's anti-Semitic. But she cannot just equate those two things, because it's actually not that simple. You can be disgusted by what's happening in Palestine. You can be disgusted by what Hamas did on October 7th. You can go on a pro-Palestinian march, and that does not make you anti-Semitic in any way, shape or form. But she seems to be able to think she can draw it down these lines that are very black and white, with no nuance, with no application of common sense, because like you so rightly said, it's a very complicated complicated issue in the Middle East that's been going on for thousands of years. But I also think
thousands of years.
thousands of
But
years.
you are right to say that. Sorry, just a little bit, because I know perhaps I've spoken too much. But there is the nuance here between the freedom of speech and the freedom to protest, which I think most people would want to see in this country. And then what Suella Braverman is saying, which is, I much prefer it if she just said there are certain things that are not acceptable on our streets, and there are certain flags that we don't want to see, and there are certain phrases that we would rather not see, thank you very much indeed, and the rest of it, fine, get on and do your job. Whereas I think you're absolutely right, Fit, she has weaponised this into becoming something which is too polarised, and it doesn't actually deal with the fact that we do celebrate the fact that people can have these opposing views and protest, but peacefully.
I think, Suella Braverman and nuance, they're not words that we would necessarily
absolutely
put together too often. But I think that, if you take that out of it, there have been images, footage that we'd have all seen from these marches. And I have no idea. I would imagine the vast majority of people on these marches aren't involved, but there are enough incidents that are really concerning.
Correct.
And the one thing that has always concerned me about anti-Semitism is just because it's not called racism, is the confidence with which people deliver it. When you look at racists who are racist purely on the basis of colour, you often notice that there's some sort of self-consciousness, or they try and qualify it because deep down or somewhere
They know it's wrong.
They know, or they feel that it's going to be judged. But there's something about anti-Semitism where when you see incidences of it, there's a level of confidence in these actions that I find...
It can very often come over as really smug racism. Do you know what I mean?
There won't be any
sort of, I can do it.
Just to interrupt, as someone who's actually been on the receiving end of racism, I've never seen anyone deal it or who has dealt it out and hasn't done it with a level of confidence, hasn't done it with a level of shame at all. But there is absolutely no place for anti-Semitism. There's absolutely no place for racism, but there's also absolutely no place for Islamophobia. And the only point that I would agree with on Suella Braverman is that there's no place for anti-Semitism. But also, she cannot equate a pro-Palestinian march to a hate march.
And there were thousands of Jewish people that were also there too. And thousands, millions around the world are also speaking out about what's happening in Gaza. It's just not as simple to say, this is a hate march.
Yeah.
I think you make a good point, Daisy, about becoming, increasingly, sadly, a political football. But I think that's one of the, issues for Starmer is that he's trying to show his credentials, given the history in the Labour Party. But the actual reality of what the Labour Party are in terms of the PLP, the activists, the council, is a lot more complex than his control of the party's mechanism.
And he is getting very tangled up in this issue of ceasefire versus humanitarian pause.
Absolutely.
And people saying it's dancing on the head of a pin because it's sort of the same thing. But actually, it does make a big difference.
It makes a massive difference.
You are calling for.
And arguably, that whole problem with anti-Semitism still sticks within the Labour Party. But I guess we will see.